In this lesson, we're going to discover the ultimate formula for solving quadratic equations. It's called the quadratic formula. So we've seen that we can always solve quadratic equations by graphing, but that is not always exact. And so sometimes we can use the square root method if there's no x term or if we have a perfect square trinomial. So in these special cases, we can use the square root method where we square root both sides. Sometimes we can factor and use this zero product property, but not all quadratics can be factored. So that's limited. And then we discovered this nice tool called completing the square. So this method will solve any quadratic equation. So this will always work. The problem is it's a little cumbersome. All right, and so if we need to quickly solve a quadratic equation, we know completing the square will work, but it can be a little tricky sometimes. So we have special cases where these other ones work. And so, when we're looking at an equation trying to solve it, we always try these first three methods first. And then if that doesn't work, well, then we're going to use completing the square or something called the quadratic formula. So let's review completing the square real quick here. All right, so when we're completing the square, we need to get the equation down to x squared plus bx. And then we're going to add b over 2 squared to both sides. So that was the strategy there. So let's try this problem here. If we want to solve this by completing the square, we could add 6 to both sides, and we get 2x squared plus x equals 6. And we don't want to do anything yet because we need to have a 1 in front of that x squared. So we've got to divide by 2. We want to get rid of this 2 here. And there's an invisible 1 there, remember? So that gives us a 1x squared plus 1 divided by 2 is 1/2 x. And then we get a equals 3. So now we need to complete the square. So we've got b over 2, or 1/2 of b squared. And in this case, b is 1/2. So we've got half coming from this divided by 2 times this half squared. So that's a 4th squared. That is 1/16. All right, 1/16. All right, so we're going to add 1/16 to this side, and we're going to add 1/16. Now, this can factor. We know it can because we made it to factor. The square root of 1/16 is 1/4. It's 1/2 times 1/2. And half of a half is, as we just said, a 4th. So that is going to factor just like that. And then if we have 3/16, this is 3 over 1. We need a common denominator times 16 times 16. That'll give us a denominator of 16. And so we'll have 48 plus 1. That's 49/16. Now we've got this exponent out here, so we want to square root. And we square root, and we get x plus 1/4 equals plus minus 7 over 16. Oops, sorry, over 4. Square root the top, square root the bottom. And so this needs to be written as two equations. We've got x plus 1/4 equals 7/4, and x plus 1/4 equals negative 7/4. It's actually an or situation there. So if we subtract a 4th from both sides here, we get x equals 6/4, which is 3/2. There's one answer. Subtract a 4th here, we get x equals negative 8/4, which is negative 2. So there's two answers there from completing the square. All right, so that is the method of completing the square. Now that always works, but again, sometimes it takes a little time. So since that always works for any quadratic equation, it should work here on this quadratic equation. But wait a minute, there's no numbers. Well, if we can solve this once with no numbers, a, b, and c, they're real numbers, but they're variables, all right? No explicit numbers, we should say. Then we can have a formula that will always work. Now, We're going to go, this is how you derive this quadratic formula. You probably will never have to derive this again unless you become a math major or a math teacher, but this is good to see that where it comes from, so you know it's not magic. All right, so here we go. We want to solve this equation. Let's go ahead and complete the square. So keep in mind here that A, B, and C are just numbers. So let me copy that down again. Let's just start over here. AX squared plus BX plus C equals 0. So we've got to get rid of that C, right? And that gives us AX squared plus BX equals negative C. Now we got to get rid of this A. We want this to be 1, right? So we need to divide the whole thing by A. And that gives us A divided by A is 1, x squared there. And then B divided by A is B over A x. And then we have negative C over A. All right, so it's starting to look like the form we need. Okay, we've got 1x squared plus something x, and then we're going to need to complete the square. Well, what do we need to use to complete the square here? Well, let's think about this. We need to find half of this coefficient here, which is b over a. So 1/2 of that squared. All right, half of that squared is going to give us b over 2a squared, which is b squared, over square of the bottom. We're going to get 4, square of the 2, square of the a squared. So we're going to add b squared over 4a squared to both sides. B squared over 4a squared. All right, so that's what completing the squared tells us to do. Now this is big and ugly, but we know that this will factor because we built it to factor. This is a perfect square, and what we'll get is when you square root this, that's what we want here. Well, what do we get when we square root b squared over 4a squared? Well, it's this thing right here, b over 2a. The square root of b squared over 4a squared is b over 2a. So that means this is going to be b over 2a, which, by the way, that's half of b over a. All right, now we need to simplify this here. Well, we've got 4a squared on the bottom, so we're going to have to multiply by 4 on top and bottom. So let's multiply top by 4 and the bottom by 4. There it is. And we're going to need to multiply by a on top and bottom. So multiply by a there and multiply by a there. All right, so this now is 4a squared on the bottom. All right, so we got a common denominator. That's great. All right, because we're going to want to put this together. So on the bottom, we're going to have 4a squared. And we're going to have b squared. I'm going to put the b squared first, minus, then we have 4 times a times c. Great. Well, how are we doing? Hanging in there? So a lot going on, but remember a, b, and c are just numbers, so we just can't clean them up because we just got a bunch of variables here. All right. Well, so we have the square root both sides here. And when we square root both sides, now we get x plus b over 2a on that side, and then we're going to get the square root. We can square root the bottom. That's going to be 2a. The top will be plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Can't do anything with the top there. Hey, we're almost done. Believe it or not, we're almost done. Now remember, this really represents two numbers. Okay. And so when we find out what a, b, and c are, we can get the positive version and we can get the negative version. That's what this is representing here. All right, so last but not least, we're going to get rid of this b over 2a, subtract b over 2a from both sides, and we end up with x equals, and we have, we're subtracting b over 2a, and so, you know, we might think of it like this, that that's the same as adding negative b over 2a, right? Subtracting b is the same as adding negative b, all right, which will give us, we have this plus minus, we got a common denominator, that's great. Okay, so we have 2a on the bottom, And on the top, we're going to put the square root second. We like to do that, remember? B squared minus 4AC, and we've got the negative b in front, and there it is. That is the quadratic formula. So we just solved this equation where we didn't exactly know what a, b, and c are. But from now on, whenever you know what a, b, and c are, and you got an equation that equals 0 like this, all you need to do is take your a, b, and c, and we can go jump right down to here. We don't have to do all that stuff again. And we've got a magic recipe. A formula is just like a recipe. If you want to bake up some answers, put your a, b, and c into here. Put in your a, put in your b, and put in your c. Do the arithmetic and get your answer. That is the quadratic formula.